Can everyone, oh gosh, you can hear me very clearly now. Good morning, it's such a pleasure to be here in Australia. And it's actually, I've just worked out my third time in Australia in the last 15 months, which is pretty incredible to be here. I'm wearing green today and everyone keeps thinking I'm Irish. I'm very much Scottish. But the reason I'm here speaking to you this morning is because I've been doing a Nuffield Farming Scholarship. And some of you that might follow me on social media, I've been pretty active in sharing my journey. And today I'm going to share a little bit about some of the learnings I've had along the way and why I think it really matters for everyone in this room, but also for wider agriculture. I'm also going to share with you a little bit about my own personal experience campaigning against the live animal export ban, which came into force in Great Britain in May this year. Some of you might have been following that, and I think it could be something really interesting to share some points about. Just a little bit of background on myself. So I was born on a small beef farm in the west coast of Scotland in a place called Ayr. But for the last decade, I've been working in the media. So I started off for about 4 years. I worked for the BBC. I wasn't a journalist. I worked as a researcher initially, and then I became a producer. I worked on news and election programmes. But my background was in farming, and I was always interested in looking more at the news story around agriculture. We had a very little thing called Brexit. And at the time, we'd left the European Union, and the BBC wasn't really covering agricultural stories. And I decided to leave, and I joined Scotland's largest national farming paper called The Scottish Farmer. And baptism of fire, I got sort of pushed into the world of agriculture. And coming from a beef farm, I didn't know very much bar about beef. So it was really a baptism of fire. But I spent the next 6 years working in agriculture on the ground, just meeting everybody I could think of, from lobbying bodies to politicians to other journalists in agriculture. I've spent so much time on the ground with farmers, really understanding the sort of pressures and the real opportunities that exist within agriculture. And then I went on to become a commentator. And I've gone back to the BBC, not internally, but I'm now a commentator. And I talk about agricultural issues to non-farming audiences. And that is my biggest passion. Because in this room, we're an echo chamber. I'm speaking to people that understand farming. And I did that for many, many years. And then I decided to get out. I still do it a little bit, but my biggest passion is how do we get people that aren't from an agricultural background excited and passionate about what we do. But when I was working on the ground with farmers, I kept being told, the media is against farmers, governments aren't interested, the public are disconnected. I was told there's an anti-farming agenda, hence the topic that you saw on the screen at the start. And I decided to do a Nuffield Farming Scholarship. And I have been travelling around the world for the best part of 18 months. I've been across Australasia, Europe, South America, Africa, Asia. I've been to 15 countries, and I've spent about 9-10 months in those countries. And I've been trying to understand how the narrative is shifting around agriculture, how we're doing in terms of engagement, where there are breakdowns in communications. And I've been trying to come up with a plan for how we can really turn it around and how we can build a more positive story about agriculture. And I know Brett has really effectively explained some of that with you here this morning. So I wanted to start by saying that farming is, of course, coming under the microscope. It's undoubtedly, we see it in the papers, we see it in terms of the noisy minority groups that are creating a lot of noise. Because they are, like Brett said, they're well organised, they're very slick, and it's understandable why so many people in agriculture are feeling under attack. They're feeling under fire. And these small groups, I know you know lots of them here in Australia, they are feeling that fire. But then there's the journalists. There's people like me. There are journalists who are competing for... Sorry, is that annoying everybody? Is that a bit better? There are journalists like me who are competing for headlines. They're competing in a space which is completely and utterly saturated. Everybody now is an expert. Everybody can tell the news. Everybody's competing for that space, and that is why so many journalists now don't have time, and we are seeing so much misinformation spreading. And I'm going to play you a little clip here from a documentary that came out in the UK. It's just a teaser, and you can see the sort of things that we're seeing on our screens.
It's their problem, it's my problem, it's your problem, it's a planetary problem.
Seeing that and understanding the scale, just sets me off.
Should we just stop eating meat?
Meat, a threat to our planet, on BBC One and iPlayer.
How was that? Great, thank you. So we are seeing, I mean, this isn't uncommon, right? We're seeing documentaries like this coming out left, right, and centre. I'm very excited that at the moment, I know Alltech, they've just been pushing ahead of a new documentary called A World Without Cows. If you've not heard about it, look up their website. I'm really excited about it. So there's some really interesting other conversations coming out. But in the UK alone, the amount of documentaries that I've seen like this, and I've had conversations with BBC editors, I've sat in their rooms, and I have challenged often some of the misinformation in some of these programmes. But by that point, the reputational damage is done. They can revoke, they can change, but often it's too late by that point. So it's understandable to think, why are farmers feeling backed into a corner? Why do we feel the need to take to the streets? And I come from the continent where everyone takes to the streets. We saw it in Brett's talk just there. I'm from Europe, and we've seen farmers, we've seen the French farmers, they particularly put on a good show, emptying their manure on the Houses of Parliament. We've seen farmers in Brussels, we've seen farmers in Germany. We've seen farmers in the Netherlands. That's where a lot of it began. And if anyone wants to talk about protests, I could do an entire other presentation on that. So maybe come and speak to me afterwards about it. But what I want to focus on is the Dutch government, because I think it's really important for everyone in this room to see what's happening in the Netherlands. Because over the last few years, the Dutch government has been progressing with some pretty aggressive policies. They've been considering putting out a buyout to farmers, dairy farmers particularly, because they're trying to reduce nitrogen emissions. And what has happened that literally up until November last year, they had put a proposal on the table to buy out farmers' right to farm. Because can you imagine being told that you sell your farm and you can't farm anywhere else in that country? And I think it was actually going to be wider than that country. It was going to be in Europe as well. So a lot of farmers considering moving. And I went and I met with lots of farmers in the Netherlands, and they were absolutely terrified. Because they were saying, yes, it's been shelved for now because the government collapsed. But that fear of the unknown is causing farmers left, right, and centre to disappear and to give up. I sat down with the largest dairy cooperative in the country, Friesland Campina, and they told me that 10 to 15% of dairy farmers will be exiting that industry in the next 12 months. 10 to 15% of dairy farmers. And if you think about the weight that the Netherlands has in terms of being an agri-export power. So I think it's really important to think about that as a microcosm for the sort of things that are happening around the world, and why it's so important that we need to start building that narrative and making sure that we've got a long-term strategy so this doesn't happen here. So I think it's understandable that often we see the negatives. We see the headlines, we see the noisy groups, and I think naturally we are programmed to seek out negativity. And really, at the end of the day, we saw it earlier in some of the talks this morning that trust in farming is incredibly high. I've now been told that belief isn't as high. I've never seen that slide before. So maybe today I'm thinking, okay, there's trust in what you do, but how do we build belief in what you do? And I remember I sat down with a New Zealand dairy farmer. Some of you might know him, Mark Gascoigne. So he was touring Scotland a year and a half ago as part of the wellbeing initiative Farmstrong. And he was talking a lot about preparing us in terms of our mental resilience. And he did a really, really powerful talk. And I remember he said to me, why do we choose to step in dog shit when we can choose to step around it? And that's often true when we look online and we see the negative stories. That's all we're drawn to, because we're often in an echo chamber. And I need to hear it, because a few years ago, I was very much campaigning online about agriculture. And I am quite prolific and really not just defending the industry, but really talking about the positives. And I got trolled. I got trolled by so many climate activists and animal rights activists. And some of the comments that I received, I went into quite a dark spiral. I felt very alone. And at the time, I got anxiety, I experienced panic attacks because I felt very much that I was being attacked. And I did, I went and saw a counsellor. And I remember thinking, she's going to give me the silver bullet for how I'm going to get through this. And she didn't. She said, look, you are never going to change how people treat you. You're never going to change how they think about you. Well, some people, the people that are really loud, you're not going to change that. All you can do is change the way you react to that. And at first I was disappointed because I thought, well, I can't just turn down the volume on these horrible comments that I'm receiving. But then I thought about it and I thought, this is about a change in mindset. This is about changing how I interpret the criticism that's coming to me and how I respond to that. So then I started to think, how do I do this? I was like, I need to look past the noise. And I think that's something we all struggle with because that noise, it echoes, right? It echoes in that echo chamber. So we don't see the positivity. And that is something I think today we're going to talk a bit about is how do you see past the noise? So we need a bit of an overhaul in our communications strategy in agriculture. Scrutiny is coming. Scrutiny is here. Everybody is scrutinizing agriculture at the moment. We're under the microscope. But it's how we respond to that scrutiny. Sorry. Is this on? Is that better? Right, good. That'll stop me gesticulating as much as well, which is good. Thank you. But agriculture is under scrutiny, and how are we responding to that? We've got to think really hard about the fact that rural depopulation isn't just an issue in the UK, it's not just an issue in Australia, it's an issue every single place I've been in the world. Everybody's flocking to our cities. And we often use that as an excuse, well, we're geographically divided. I know in Australia it's much easier than in Scotland. I think, God, in Scotland we're probably within minutes, if not an hour from our major cities. Every farmer would tell you that. Here in Australia, it's different. 95% of your population lives within 50 kilometres of the coast. That's hard. And people say, well, how can we connect? But the thing is, we don't have a choice. You've got to connect. You've got to find a way to go to them. And we hear about, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that we're doing in the UK, sort of having open days and different things. But we've got to get smarter in how we actually find ways to get to know our customers, get to know and find relevance in their life and show interest. We've got to show up. It's like we take to the streets on tractors. And I always say to farmers, have you taken to the streets to campaign for nurses' protests? Have you done that because there's, something totally unrelated to agriculture? Are you showing up? So I think we need to, as an industry, start showing up and really breaking down that divide ourselves, because members of the public in the cities, they've got a lot to think about. So we've got to make ourselves find a way into those circles. And going back to that question of scrutiny, everybody's asking questions about agriculture. They want to know, what is our impact on climate? What are we doing to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? Those questions are coming. They might not be paying for it, but they are asking those questions. You might recognize this gentleman on the screen here, Dr. Frank Mitloehner. So he's an amazing man, and he is actively championing the livestock industry globally. But for him, he founded the Clear Center at UC Davis in California. And they are using science and data, but in a really simplistic way, to counteract some of the misinformation which is being leveled at the livestock industry. And he always talks about the fact, and Annalene mentioned it this morning, about the fact as farmers, you're the experts. You're the experts. No one else knows what you do better than anyone else. Everyone thinks they know what you do because they have an agenda. And the line that I always like with him is that if we don't respond to the questions, if we close up, if we become defensive, there's a knowledge gap. And who's going to fill that knowledge gap? It's people that tend to want to discredit what you do. So we've got to think about, how do we make sure that somebody else isn't jumping in, somebody else isn't telling your story? And my last couple of points on this slide, you can see behind me, there's an orchestra on the screen. And some of you might know this analogy already. I found about it when I came to Australia in March. And I went and visited the Australian Farm Institute. And I asked them about advocacy. I wanted to know who was advocating on behalf of Australian agriculture. And they said, well, we have 270 self-declared advocacy bodies. And I know we could sit here and argue and say, well, they're not all advocacy bodies. I get that a lot. But these are 270 groups. I mean, that's madness, right? That's absolute madness. If you're a government that is trying to legislate, who do you go to? Who do you speak to? Because the message becomes disunited. And you're sharing so many different resources. Well, we should be sharing more resources, but instead we are working in so many one-man bands. And a one-man band makes a lot of noise. It doesn't create a legacy. We've got to start thinking, how do we pull together all those different components? Like an orchestra, you've got to play in rhythm. You've got to find that harmony. And I think it's a really beautiful analogy. Let's create an advocacy orchestra for Australian agriculture. And I'm sure that's something we could deploy in other parts of the world as well. But I think here, that 270 number, it's crazy. I think it's something, I know a lot of people in this room have spoken to me about it, it's something that needs to change. And the question I get asked, and I throw it back to yourself, is who's going to lead that advocacy orchestra? There's a few people that have put ideas forward for me, but I'd love to speak to some of you about that, because I think it's a question we all need to ask. So I've been talking about that opportunity to engage. The UK, we're doing some really interesting things. Some of you might have heard about it. So we have Open Farm Sunday, we have the Royal Highland Educational Trust. These are all charities, these are all movements, which are all based around this idea of how do we open our gates, how do we bring the public in, and how do we create that lifelong relationship with the public. And they're brilliant, but the problem is very few farmers are doing it. Very few farmers put their hands up and say, I want to engage with the public. Because the farmers I speak to, they're oversubscribed. They can't actually fit all the interest onto their farms on those days. And the problem is sometimes it's only once a year. Well, we all know with learning in general, it's got to be consistent, hasn't it? So we've got to think of other ways that we can do that. And in your communities, I know some of you will live in areas where you are 2-3 hours away from people. So yeah, we've got to get creative in terms of how are you finding ways to be able to build those points of connection. But, piggyback on something that's already happening. Turn up with your livestock. Do a show and tell. People are connected to animals and people. People want you to be there, and you're going to create memories with people. I know muster dogs. It's a really powerful program, right? Because people love seeing you working with your livestock. They love seeing you working with your dogs. I think building something like that and continuing it is really important. And we've got to stop convincing we've got to stop convincing farmers to love farmers. We've got to start convincing those that don't. And so many of our efforts, again, are in that echo chamber. And when we do speak to the public, it's often in times of crisis, because that is our communication strategy. It's often a crisis communication strategy. But how do we get ahead? Because at the end of the day, if we're always going and putting our hand out, and that's what happens with government ministers. When I speak to ministers, they see, hour after hour, every single day, they have people coming to them with problems, coming to them asking for money. But nobody comes to them when things are good. No one comes and says, there's some really wonderful things happening. Yes, I'm speaking in extreme terms here, but in general, we go with our problems. But actually get them excited about what you're doing as an industry, so they want to come and stick up for you and put their voice out and put their necks on the line for you. We want to get the government excited. We want to get the media excited, because we tend to speak to the media when things are bad. We don't speak to the media when things are going really good. And I think it's really important to be thinking, how do we build that army of support now? So when the shit hits the fan, we can pull on that army of support. And that's really important. I'm looking at my countdown clock here, and I'm going to have to push on a little bit. But I want to speak to you this morning a little bit about live animal exports. And I spoke to some of the team earlier in the trade stands yesterday about it. I know this is an incredibly emotional topic. I know this has gripped a lot of the communities here in Western Australia. And I've gone through it a little bit at home. I've just told you we have just had a ban passed in the UK, sorry, not the UK, in Great Britain. Northern Ireland is not included in that. That was in May this year. So I understand the financial, the emotional, the mental burden that is having on so many people. And I wanted to share a little bit about what happened in our story. So in 2017, our DEFRA secretary, so that was our UK Agriculture Secretary for the Conservative government at the time, he put forward a proposal that we were going to have a ban on live animal exports. This is not sheep, this is all live animal exports. I remember 2017 very well because I was the political editor of Scotland's national farming paper, and the rural communities in Scotland went into absolute panic because this was a blanket ban proposal. They were going to ban internal transit of animals. So for those that maybe know Scotland, we've got a lot of little islands who are all ferrying their livestock onto the mainland because we have a shortage of abattoirs. And Orkney in particular, the following January, they closed down their main abattoir. And the island of Orkney, that is the backbone of their community, is agriculture. And I remember at the time, our community, our farming community, went into absolute overdrive. How on earth are we going to start doing something to turn this around? And I was very impressed with the National Farming Union at the time. They had everything. They had working groups. They had so many discussions. They wrote to every single cross-party politician. They had invitations going out to come and see our boats, come and see our cassette systems that were transporting these animals. Everything you could think about that they did it. And I myself, so I travelled to Orkney, and I thought, what can I do? And I went and I filmed the transportation of that livestock arriving at the auction mart, going into the laird, getting onto the ferry, the overnight ferry. I got them coming off and going off to be processed or fattened. And I wanted to capture that story. I wanted to capture the emotion of it. I wanted to capture the people that were connected. And I interviewed animal welfare inspectors. I interviewed the captain of the boat to understand what that was like to be able to be steering those animals overnight. I spoke to every single politician that I could think of. And then our paper and myself, we made sure in the months that came forward, we went into every mainstream outlet we could think of. I spoke to the BBC. I spoke to local radio. We made sure that every man and their dog knew that story, because it was so, so important to our communities. And I put there, so 85 to 90% of the livestock that was transported off Orkney was for store. So not only was Orkney affected, the whole of the northeast of the country, those farmers depended on that livestock coming to them. Those numbers might seem small to you, 138,000 sheep, 26,000 cattle, huge for Scotland. That was a massive deal for us. A few years later, consultations went out. 2021, so both the UK and the Scottish Government were consulting on this. And our politicians at that time that we had worked with to really campaign with, they wrote to their governments on behalf of agriculture, and they said, this will not do, this has to get changed. And it happened. They revoked it. So they revoked the internal transit ban. So our rural island communities, they were protected. And that was because right early on, we had that engagement. We brought every single politician from across the divide, particularly those from those rural communities. We got them engaged. We got them to really care about what was happening. And the reason I'm telling this story is because obviously I can't stand up here and tell you what's been happening over here because I've not been here. But what I've done over the last few weeks is I have been having phone calls with representatives of your industry. I've spoken to ag leaders, I've spoken to lobbying bodies, I've spoken to journalists, I've spoken to farmers, and I've spoken to a lot of the civil servants working for the government, and some of those that were working during the live animal export conversations. And in general, the message that I got back was there needed to be better engagement when this was first mentioned in 2019. This is when this had to happen. Because now what I'm seeing is that you've got this amazing swell of support. I spoke to some of the guys yesterday. It's phenomenal, the campaigning that you're doing. But the problem is you've now got a government in that has a program of government to implement that depends on this ban coming into place. So it's not going to get revoked. And that's the thing that I think sometimes we lose sight of is what about that early engagement? And this comes back to my idea about that communication strategy, that engagement strategy. We've got to start thinking much, much longer term. And that brings me on to my next point, setting that tone for the future. Every single person in this room that works in agriculture, you're all long-term thinkers. Every decision that you make on your farm, the genetics that you're choosing for your sheep, you don't see the results of that for 5, 10 years, the real results of that. You are patient, you play the game, you play the long-term game. So I know agriculture is very capable of that. Governments, politics, it's short-term. It changes. I think sometimes we get caught up in that. And this is why I'm saying, take a look around what's happening globally. In the last 8-9 months alone, those 4 pictures that I've depicted on the screen, that's 4 different countries that I've traveled in, that they've had a change in government. Argentina, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and just recently we had a change of government in the UK. All different governments with very different views on agriculture. We've got to start thinking long-term because governments come and go like a pendulum swings. So how are we engaging with every single politician across that divide to make sure when those changes come, we're ready? Because agriculture is going to outlive every government. Of course it is. And the other thing that's not maybe an easy thing to say to you today, but you've got a new agricultural minister. She's just been appointed recently. This is your opportunity to engage. It's not your opportunity to shake your fists at her and tell her you're upset about what's happened with the live animal exports. She knows everything. She is across the entire brief. What you need to do is see that as an opportunity to actually engage with her what is happening on the ground that she does not know. Because that's the things that she needs to know about. Because the next thing that's going to come down the line, whether that's biosecurity, whether it's pain relief, whether it's mulesing, you need to be thinking, how can I set the tone and that relationship with my minister now? So down the line, I can pull on that and she will represent my industry because she cares about what we do because we've made an effort to really build that trust with her. So that would be my advice to you. When I speak to ministers, when I speak to civil servants, my goodness, those early days of engagement, they will set the tone for everything moving forward. Building trust and transparency. There's always going to be bad apples in every industry. You've had plenty of your own here, and I know the sheep and wool sector have been particularly good at calling it out. And you have to do that, but I'm going to tell you to do something more. You've got to call it out yourselves before someone else has told you there's a problem. Because if you can do that, you can set the narrative so no one else does it for you. And the example I'm going to use here is I went to Kenya, and I particularly went to Kenya to visit this farm called Kakuzi. They are one of the biggest avocado and macadamia farms in the country, and they had their reputation completely in tatters because a British journalist had done an investigation into alleged human rights abuses on their farm. Every single supermarket contract was dropped. They had thousands of employees that suddenly, their jobs, their livelihoods were on the line because this business had lost that trust. I'm not going to go into the actual allegations or the story about that, but what they did to build back from that was they worked with a PR strategy team, and they said to them, we are going to do a full transparency movement moving forward. And in Africa, that's quite unusual, because there's always going to be issues on every single farm. And if you are a UK supermarket, you want a perfect record of anybody that you're taking products from. And they did something very unusual, because the supermarket said, well, we're seeing all these things that you're reporting on that's happening on your farm. Why would we come and touch you? And they said, we're just going to be patient, and we're going to make sure we put everything out there that we do wrong, because then we can come up with a strategy very publicly in how we're dealing with it. And what they effectively did was build credibility and trust and respect, and all the supermarkets came back. It took time, it took a lot of time, but they're now held up as an example of how to act as a business, because they've done something, and they took the risk of knowing in the short term it was going to be a bit messy, but it's been a really strong lesson to think about. How do you do that? Because what they have done is made sure that nobody else can write the problems that they have in their industry. They're telling the narrative themselves. Early engagement with the mainstream media. I'm a big fan of this conversation because I just don't think we're tapping into it. We're not using the mainstream media. We sometimes use the farming media, but I think sometimes we're even guilty of not even using our own journalists. But we've got to remember, we can't keep going to the media in times of crisis. We're just giving them onto their lap an opportunity to write a salacious and difficult headline. You've got to start thinking, how do I get in touch with the media way before we've got a problem? Because if you can get the media on your side, you have got a powerful resource there that you can use. It's free advertising for agriculture. If you build those relationships with journalists, it's like, anytime I do anything, it's the first thing that I do is I get to know every single person in the room. Who are the reporters? Who do I speak to? Who do I go to lunch with? Who do I get to know what they're interested in? Get to know their patch. Find out about them. Make sure that you can call on them. And the thing about a journalist that's so quite exciting, and I think something we don't really think about, is we have such power of influence. Sometimes when I write my columns, it's scary, the responsibility, because I can speak to thousands and thousands of people, and I have the power to influence others. And the people that I influence have the power to influence government. And you see where I'm going with this. If you can get the media on side, they influence the public, they influence the government, then suddenly when it comes to them creating that program for government, you've got people that understand what you're doing. And there are obviously other ways to tell your story. You've got so many people here in Australia, I've seen them on TikTok, on Instagram, on X, who are telling their story. But we're doing it often in echo chambers. Even our podcasts, they're fantastic. The information that I'm hearing on them, it's wonderful. But are they interesting to my friend that's an artist? My friend that's a dentist? They're not, because we're not always finding ways to do that. But this guy, I don't think there's many people in this room that don't know him or haven't watched him, okay? So this guy right here, he's probably the single worst farmer in the world. But what he is the single best communicator. Jeremy Clarkson, love him or hate him, what he has done for this industry is remarkable. He has put agriculture on the map, but he has done that through building connections, through building emotions. He uses humor, and that's a really thing we should all think about. I'm not always very good at that. I tend to be quite serious. But Jeremy uses humor to connect with millions of people. And what he's done for every single person in this room is he has provided a masterclass in what we can all do to be able to connect with people. So he's just created a channel for us to follow. So we're all very grateful to Jeremy Clarkson for that, because we can all follow what he is doing and learn how to build connections with people. And yes, he was famous before, that does help. And he's also a journalist turned farmer, so he knows how to write a story, he knows how to tell a story. But the main thing he knows to do is to connect with people and to take them on a journey, to make it relevant and interesting to them. I realise my time is ticking down, Jess. I realise I'm getting a bit tight here. But just some take-home messages from today. We've got to play the long-term game with our communication strategy. We've got to get out of the reactive space. Agriculture is going to continue to be scrutinised. Of course it is. See this as an opportunity. We've got to think about what can we showcase what we're doing, and don't let anyone else fill that gap for us. Don't let those self-proclaimed experts tell your story. It's really important that we do that. We've got to remember as well that we're all a main character in our own story. What happens in our echo chamber is what's important to us. Sometimes when we engage, we've got to step into someone else's main character. What do they care about? What is the problems that they're facing that day? And to think more about what's affecting them when we make our decisions. Building that early army of support. I talked about it earlier. The earlier you can engage with your ministers, the earlier you can engage with the media, the earlier that you can engage with the public, that is how you create an army. So when things go wrong, you can pull on them and they've got your back. And my last point there, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That advocacy orchestra, we've got to start building it. We've got to start thinking, how can we have a collective voice? Because my goodness, the talent in this room, the talent that I've come across in Australian agriculture, imagine we actually harness that. Imagine we started bringing that together, the power that can be. And I've seen you all come together in times of struggle. If we could start coming together in times of peacetime as well and start using that, that's going to be quite incredible. And I know this morning, I normally stand on the stage and I tell stories from my travels, and I'm happy to do that with anyone afterwards. And this is more about what can we do. This is slightly more on the confronting side. But the reason I've shared this today is because I so care about this industry. I've dedicated my career to championing agriculture, and I will continue to do that when I move here to Australia. I'm going to continue championing and learning about what you do. But the big thing for me is I don't want anyone in this room to feel silenced or undermined. I want everybody in this room to not allow someone else to tell your story. So if you can take something away from today as well, think about how can you make sure you get in front and make sure you tell the narrative that you want to tell. Thank you.